The one.
Okay.
Well, if he has a minute, I want to explain to him.
Okay.
Just forward.
Why don't you, do you want to just come down?
Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is George Kedoku. I teach political science here at Westchester Community College. Together with two colleagues of mine, Professors Barbara Connolly, Professor Fahad Amin, we submitted a proposal to the SUNY State University of New York Conversations in the Disciplines program to host a series of lectures throughout the 2014-2015 academic year. The theme for our lectures is poverty, misconceptions, and realities. And we're going to we brought together scholars who have spent considerable number of years thinking about how different societies organize themselves economically. And our first lecture, which will start here, would begin from Europe. But next month, we are glad to have Professor Sylvia Nasser from Columbia University, who would also set up the background story to poverty for us. We are glad to have Professor Nasser with us today, and thank you very much.
Welcome to Westchester Community College. Please note that if an emergency occurs, you will hear an alarm or receive verbal instructions. The locations of exits are in the rear of the auditorium, as well as to your left and right. Please walk to the nearest exit. This will lead you outside or to a stairwell. Do not use the elevator and move away from the building until instructed to re-enter. If needed, there is an infrared hearing system available, which can be borrowed from the ticket booth. We ask that all cell phones and beepers now be turned off. Thank you and enjoy the show.
That was not planned, but I think it's a good information. So. Now, I'll say a little bit about the SUNY CID program. The idea is to promote interactions and conversations among the faculty and staff of all the SUNY 64 campuses. And we're glad to have some of our colleagues who've traveled from the city and other places with us today. Now, I would also take this opportunity to acknowledge the support we've received from the Foundation Board, especially Martha and Ted Nuremberg Endowed Faculty Chair for Economics, Business Strategy, and the Carl and Lily Folsheimer Foundation Endowed Chair for Business and Public Policy, and then Macmillan Education. Now, after we've received the news that our proposal has been accepted by SUNY, we got even more interesting news and good news from Professor Paul Krugman, who accepted our invitation to be the first lecturer for the opening series. And I'm going to speak a little bit about Professor Krugman because my entire class, there were only about 2 people who have heard of him. Dr. Krugman is a professor of economics at Princeton University, a distinguished scholar at the Luxembourg Center, CUNY Graduate Center, and a New York Times columnist. And last but not the least, and this is really for my students who are here, he is also a Nobel laureate. Please join me in welcoming Professor Krugman to the stage. We started a little bit earlier because we have differences in time, but Professor Krugman will be with us. Thank you.
Okay, well, good afternoon. Thanks to
WCC, for inviting me here. Thanks for coming. I think the way to get into this talk is I want to tell you a little bit about some things I've been doing in terms of teaching. So I'm at Princeton, although I will be moving to CUNY at the end of this year, and I'm sitting in the Woodrow Wilson School. And just about 8 years ago, I invented a new course for the Woodrow Wilson School. And it came about this way. Wearing my other hat, newspaper columnist, I'd been very involved in a political argument at the time, which was the question, what are we going to do about Social Security? And many people may remember there was a proposal to fundamentally change the program that was coming out of the Bush administration, to change it in a way that would, over time, have converted it into something like a giant 401k, a defined benefit, a defined contribution, personal accounts instead of what it still is, in fact, which is a set of a guaranteed income in retirement. I thought this was a really bad idea. Your mileage may vary, but I and many others thought this was a really bad idea, argued against it. In the course of the argument, it turned out there was a lot of things you wanted to talk about. You wanted to talk about international experiences. You wanted to talk about the retirement program in Chile, which was elevated by many people as being a role model. It turns out that Chileans actually hate it, and they've introduced something that kind of looks like Social Security as a partial replacement. You wanted to talk, so you looked at a bunch of things. Then after that debate sort of faded away, there was a question of, well, okay, we know what you're against, what are you for? And I and a bunch of other people started saying, well, we're for some kind of health reform that will guarantee insurance. And again, you want to look at a bunch of international comparisons. Two things. One, it became obvious to me that we actually had a set of questions that belong together that are not actually part of any one course in the way we teach economics. Retirement policy, unemployment policy, health policy tend to be scattered. So I said we should have a course on the economics of the welfare state, and so, how all of these things fit together. And the other is that very much looking across countries is an essential part of this. And once you view all of these programs as being part of a common theme, how does the government, if it does, how does it go about providing guarantees for retirement or income support in periods of unemployment or aid to the poor or whatever? You have, if you like, a wonderful set of laboratories of policy. We use the states are the laboratories of democracy. Well, it turns out on the welfare state, nations are the laboratories of welfare state options. Some countries, the way I would put this is that all advanced countries are in many ways quite similar. If you ask what's the level of technology in France or Germany or Italy or Japan, it's the same as it is here. There'll be a few things, you know, I'm trying to think what we actually have that's better in terms of daily life. We do, but you know, you'll find that some things are done better and some worse, but no clear difference, right? We have worse passenger rail and better freight rail than they do, you know, whatever. But so productivity levels are quite similar, technological levels are quite similar, sophistication, all advanced countries are extremely sophisticated technologically. They're all run by government officials who are not ideal but are not idiots, mostly. And but we make very different choices, hugely different choices about how we're going to run our societies. So I just heard that how societies can be run differently, enormously different choices. I like the comparison of France and the United States. It turns out that productivity, as best we can measure it, productivity per person hour worked, is about the same in France and the United States. I think within the limits of measurement, you'd want to say they're the same. But we have our system, which is relatively light regulation of labor markets, relatively not generous social programs. Even the United States, an important point is even the United States, which has the least expansive welfare state in the Western world, it's still big, Common description of the federal government in particular. The U.S. government is basically a giant insurance company with an army, right? This is what we mostly do. But still much less so than France. Less government expenditure, less generous, different programs for retirement. Obviously the French have had a form of guaranteed health care for a long time. Differences in unemployment benefits. And the fact that all of these systems are out there gives you a lot of information on on what the choices are. If we look at measures of income distribution, for the most part, as best we can tell, and I'm actually associated with people who work on these data now, the Luxembourg Income Study List Center, which is actually has now a branch in New York, which I'm becoming part of. If we look at market incomes, they are, except for the very top, quite similarly distributed in all advanced countries. There's not that much difference in wages. There's some. We have more low-wage work and so on, and we have our 1%, which is mostly, our 1% is much further away from the rest than is the case in most advanced countries, although Britain also looks like us a little bit. But the after tax and transfer inequality is very different. Again, because we do much less, we have lower taxes, we have less social programs. So countries make very different choices about that. And it's interesting. It means that you get some chance to figure out what works and what doesn't. Just a quick note there. If you are looking to find examples of, if your notion is either we do everything wrong and they do everything right, or vice versa, you're going to find out that life is more complicated than that. That countries are, so although the welfare state is a common subject, different pieces work quite differently. So you learn that too. You learn that the U.S. retirement system actually is regarded as a role model in many countries. On the other hand, the U.S. healthcare system is banging your head on the table awful. So you get all of these different insights. And I've thought that I find this a really, the students find it, I think, illuminating as well, to see that there are these different choices. However, if you get into the political arena, you talk about how do people out there in the news media, how do people in Congress talk about these issues, you discover that they have a lot of images in their head that are either completely wrong or out of date, or based upon casual generalizations that don't hold up. And in particular, there's a lot of belief by many politicians in the United States that European welfare states are an outright failure, that they've just completely been a disaster, which is actually based on a couple of things. And one of them is the very real economic mess currently taking place in Europe. The other is this odd thing, which I'll explain in a bit, that our perceptions of how it works in Europe, for some reason, froze about 15 years ago. Ask people even relatively well-informed people, what they think employment is like in France, what they think job creation is like in France or Sweden. They'll tell you something that actually was sort of kind of true in 1997, 1998, but is not at all true anymore. And so I want to talk about what do we actually know about these European welfare states? Again, Europe is a great comparison because the Europeans are like us in most respects, equally sophisticated, equal technology. I think you have to say equal capabilities, but very different political choices. And so it's great stuff. Okay, but the first thing you have to say is, that favorite George Orwell quote. It's actually from an article called Boys' Weeklies. But it's not exactly apropos, but just he was saying at the time, this was the 1930s, that in adventure stories you always went to Africa or something, or to the Gobi Desert or something to have adventures. And actually at the time, if you really wanted to know where you could have adventures and confront villains and have your life threatened, it was Europe. And these days, actually, that's not, hopefully we're not having those kinds of adventures. Not yet, anyway. But if you're looking for economic adventures, crises, it used to be that you actually would want to go to the third world. These days, just go to Europe. Anyway, Europe is doing very badly in this recent economic turmoil. We have had the Great Recession. There's been some argument about what to call it. I actually have been trying to get people to call it the Lesser Depression, because we are actually experiencing something that qualitatively is a lot like the Great Depression. It's not as bad as the Great Depression. I was actually suggesting that as a re-election slogan for Obama. It's not as bad as the Great Depression. They didn't pick up on that one. But it's been really terrible. Now, but however bad it's been in the U.S., it's been far worse in Europe. Now, caveats: the unemployment rate, we think, is not giving us a full picture of it looks like we're back to almost normal unemployment, but it doesn't feel that way. Lots of involuntary part-time work, lots of people who seem to have dropped out of the workforce are not actively searching for jobs. So that's an imperfect indicator. Still, I think the picture here is broadly accurate. That the United States has had a slow, inadequate recovery, but at least a recovery. Europe, this is the euro area, the European countries sharing the single currency. Europe has essentially had no recovery at all. In fact, they went back into what was clearly a second recession and are very possibly heading into a third one right now. I sometimes like to say that the Europeans and and ourselves, that we've been in a contest as to who can do the worst job in responding to the financial crisis. And for the moment, at least, the Europeans are winning. We've done a pretty impressive task of responding badly, but they've done an even worse job. Question is, so the first question is, I've been talking about how European countries make very different choices from ours. Is this telling us that their choices are not actually sustainable? And that's something that you hear a lot. So this is, I just picked up, well, oh, sorry, I forgot to mention one thing. So, sorry, I'll get there in a second. I say this is the Lesser Depression, that it's like the Great Depression, only not as bad. Except actually in Europe, it's not entirely clear. At this point, now Europe, it turns out the European Great Depression wasn't as deep as ours. We had a really bad one. Theirs mostly less so, although Germany was comparable, which had some consequences. But by this point in the 1930s, so we're now 7 years into the crisis, by this point in the 1930s, Europe was experiencing a strong recovery. Whereas this time around, although the initial drop wasn't as deep, there's been not much, if any, recovery. And so actually, incredibly, industrial production and also, as best we can estimate it, GDP in Europe are now below where they were at this point in the Great Depression. They've actually managed to, there was a very good article in Vox EU, a current affairs journal, called "If Only It Were the 1930s." Because in Europe, they're actually at this point doing worse than they were at this point in the 1930s. Quite a remarkable thing. Okay, why? So I have no idea who this guy is, actually. I just picked up, I went searching for and found a commentary in Forbes. And this is the kind of thing you hear and see quite a lot. You can find quite similar quotes from leading politicians. Paul Ryan has said essentially the same thing, that what we're witnessing in Europe is the collapse of the welfare state. That's why everything has gone wrong. And if that were true, if Europe's economic woes were really about the failures of the welfare state, that would be a pretty strong argument. Now, I think any card-carrying economist has to agree that if you provide generous benefits and you have high taxes, it's going to have some effect on incentives. But is the effect on incentives so large that what you get is economic collapse? And that's a story that's often told. It is not a story that holds up very well once you start to look even a bit more deeply than just, oh, Europe has big welfare states and Europe is doing badly. And this is the, I'm sorry, I'm really scatterbrained today. Bear with me. Let me just, all right. You know what? Let me skip and do it this way, and I'll come back to that in a second. This is just a example of what you see if you do even a sort of casual, well, more not totally casual, but you do some look at the data. How big is the welfare state? A good indicator, not perfect, but pretty good, is just how big is government spending relative to the economy. Now you want to be a little bit careful. So this is actually on the horizontal axis, that's government spending as a share of GDP in 2007. Because the crisis has changed those numbers, partly because GDP went down, so even if you have the same size programs, it gets bigger, but also because some programs kick in when the economy is in a terrible slump. So the US had a temporary, very temporary surge in government spending because of unemployment insurance and food stamps to a lesser extent. Anyway, this is just about all of the advanced countries. I took out the really tiny ones. I don't have San Marino in there, but share of government spending as a percent of GDP in 2007, and the growth in per capita GDP, essentially economic growth from 2007 to 2013, which in many cases is a negative number, because this has been a really bad period. And I hope mostly the labels tell you who we're talking about. And so you see the really clear relationship between high government spending and I don't, actually. I imagine no one else does either. So Greece is the pessimum pessimorum of this crisis, and they did have a pretty big government even before the crisis. However, not as big as Austria, which is up there near the upper right, not nearly as big as Sweden, and those are countries that weathered the crisis really quite well. Sweden did really very well from 2007 to 2013. They're now in the process of fixing that by having a really disastrous monetary policy, but that's another story. France, which is actually, at these days, France has the biggest government in the Western world, bigger than Sweden, kind of a surprise. And France gets incredible bad press. That's a pet peeve of mine. You keep on reading stories about how terrible France is, and it's the sick man of Europe, and it's not great, but actually they're not, if you actually look at the numbers, they don't look that bad. They've held up better than a lot of other European countries. Not as well as Germany, which is up there at the top, but not too badly. It's also, by the way, interesting that among other things, you hear France is overwhelming debt, and they're collapsing, and they're going to go bankrupt. And you might ask, if that's true, why are people willing to buy 10-year French bonds at an interest rate that, as of this morning, was 1.28%? So it actually doesn't, anyway, I think that is part of actually the story, that there's a lot of people who have a narrative in their mind which says that big welfare states must be disastrous. France has a big welfare state, therefore it must be a disaster. You look at the actual numbers, it doesn't actually look that way. Ireland, relatively small government, disaster. And actually, it's relatively small government and was widely described by pro-market people as a role model in terms of having wide open markets and being business friendly. That didn't stop them from having a disaster. All around, it's all over the place, basically. There is no, it turns out if you actually look, there is no evidence at all that having a big welfare state contributes to having had a bad Great Recession. There's no evidence that it contributed to having a good Great Recession either. There's basically just no association. Actually, sorry, I don't know why I'm doing so nonlinear here. There is a different story, and this is where we have I think this is a more serious discussion. And the sort of casual, Europe has big welfare states and it's having a crisis, is wrong. There is a different story which I myself, I guess I would say, used to take very seriously and still think has something to it. So eurosclerosis, this is a widespread term. It originates with, this is Herbert Gersch, German economist, writing about this actually, I think originally even earlier than this, but this is the first paper I could scare up. What Geertz was arguing, and what many people have argued, including me to some extent, is that Europe in the 70s and 80s, by having highly interventionist government, if you hired somebody, very difficult to fire them, high costs because there were very heavy payroll taxes, not much incentive to take jobs because of generous open-ended unemployment benefits, that Europe was suffering. Basically, the incentives to work and produce were diminished, and that this made Europe lag. There was a period there when European unemployment, which had previously been below U.S. levels, rose to well above U.S. levels, when European employment fell dramatically relative to the United States, and so on, and that this was, at least to some extent, tied to the very generous welfare states. Now, obviously, political moral. I don't know how many people, this was delivered to the Mount Pelerin Society, which it turns out is a place where conservative economists have been, I think they first convened in 1947 and have been, ever since, have been trying to do whatever they can to roll back the New Deal. But anyway, it's, but it's not a foolish thing. Now, the signature, the reason you knew that eurosclerosis or something was a big problem was that in the late 1980s and on to the 1990s, you discovered that European economies were remarkably vulnerable to stagflation. That whenever they loosened monetary policy and pumped up the economy and tried to have a recovery, that inflation would start to accelerate even though unemployment was 9 or 10%. And so that was telling you that actually they somehow created a structural rate of unemployment that was very high. The economy is just, the supply side of the economy wasn't working too well. What's interesting is that people talk as if that were the problem now, and it very much is not. So Europe now, inflation, stagflation, is definitely not their problem. Their problem instead is that inflation is way too low. Way too low, certainly in the sense that they don't want it to be this low. The European Central Bank is supposed to hit their official guideline is they want an inflation rate of close to but below 2%, which is slightly weird. But anyway, something like a 2% inflation rate is what they're seeking, and there are various reasons why we think that 2% inflation is probably better than zero. Gives you more flexibility in a number of dimensions, particularly now, actually, when you have a clear need to reduce costs in Spain relative to Germany. It's a lot easier to do that by having German wages rise than having Spanish wages fall. So some inflation is desirable, but they can't get it. So this is core inflation. It takes out food and energy, which are volatile, and it's running at under 1% and falling. People ask, well, are we going to have deflation? And I think actually if this goes on long enough, yes, but that's not the point. Zero is not a red line. This inflation rate is already low enough that it's causing lots of problems, among other things because when people took on debts expecting there to be 2% inflation, if there's only 0.8% or 0.7%, that means that the debt ends up being worth a lot more in terms of purchasing power. It ends up being a much bigger burden than they expected, and that's happening all along. So the problem, the thing that's inhibiting European growth now is not that they can't get people to work or that they have, or that employers don't want to hire, because if that were the problem, then you would expect to see inflation accelerating. It is instead that they just can't get enough spending, and so they're suffering from a lack of demand. If that's the right story, you might expect something else to be a better explanation of who has done well and who has done badly in this crisis. And the answer, and in particular, you'd expect that governments that were gung-ho about trying to balance their budgets, or countries that made big spending cuts or big tax increases or both, should be doing worse. And that I'm all out of order here, but I'll give the talk I wanted to, not the talk that was actually set up in the slides. That is true. So change in structural balance, that's an estimate of how much the budget deficit would have been reduced if the economy had not slumped. So it's an estimate of what would have happened to spending and revenues at full employment. What distinguishes Greece? What distinguishes Greece is huge spending cuts plus tax increases. Altogether, 13% of GDP, which if you want to think, that would be as if the United States imposed spending cuts on government of well over $2 trillion. That would be an incredible hit to our economy. You can imagine that would send us into another Great Depression. In Greece, it has. They've had a catastrophic decline. Now, those were imposed because of the debt crisis within Europe and so on, but that's a story. It's kind of interesting, actually. I sometimes have people say, oh, austerity can't be a problem. The Germans have had lots of austerity and they're doing fine. They actually haven't had all that much austerity. They've had some, which is, we can argue is a mistake, but the Germans talk a lot about how austerity is essential for other people. And but in general, what you find is that these austerity programs are really what explains. And then if you ask why has Europe done so badly, it comes down to the circumstances that have made it impossible for many European countries to avoid huge spending cuts. And that in turn comes down to this terrible mistake they made, which is to have one currency without a single government. So actually, diversion there for a second. I like to do the comparison. If you want to understand why Europe is in so much trouble, I like to do the comparison between Spain and Florida, which in many ways are quite similar in terms of the run-up. You know, both have relatively warm climates, lots of beachfront, lots of coastal real estate, lots of houses and condos bought by people who were seeking a second residence or seeking to retire there. Both had mammoth housing bubbles, which then burst. When Florida's housing bubble burst, the state went into a severe recession, and there was a big drop in tax receipts. Income tax payments went way down, costs of things like unemployment benefits went way up. There were programs that still had to be paid for, like health care and retirement. But in Florida, health care, well, Medicare, paid for from Washington. Retirement, Social Security, paid for from Washington. Unemployment benefits, mostly paid for from Washington. A lot of losses, a lot of banks failed, were rescued by Washington. A lot of losses on home loans that fell on Fannie and Freddie, the lending agencies in Washington. Spain, all the same things happened, except it was all their problem. It was all, where hardly any of the costs of the housing bust fell on Tallahassee, all of the costs of the Spanish housing bust fell on Madrid. And so Spain has a fiscal crisis, and that's really the story. If the Europeans had, the Europeans had a single currency, which meant that Spain had no ability to devalue the currency or do any of the other things that countries historically do when they have a crisis, but they did not create a common European government, and so they left these countries extremely exposed. And that is really the European story, and it's telling you that it has nothing much to do with the welfare state. It's a wholly different problem. And well, I'm sick of telling them that this austerity is a mistake and the Germans need to provide more aid. It's true, and I and my colleagues on this are right, and nobody cares. So anyway, but I want to talk about the other piece, about what has happened to eurosclerosis. That's really where I want to come in. So the picture, if I were writing about this in 1997, 1998, as I did, you would say that, okay, look at these European countries, they're trying to do a lot to diminish poverty, to make people's lives more secure. They're spending a lot of money. It's all well-intentioned. It may even be something that you think is worth doing, but it has consequences. It means that people have less incentive to take jobs. It means that employers have less incentive to offer jobs. It's just you can see how this could contribute to persistently weak economic growth, persistently low employment. Thing is, time moves on. And one really interesting thing that happened in Europe in the course of the decade, largely from 1998, 1999 on, was that they improved the pieces of that system. They made it, labor contracts remain, there's far more protection of worker rights than we have here, but not quite as restrictive as before, so that contract work became available, part-time work became available. Some of the tax and benefit things were revised. And if you look at a comparison, a head-to-head comparison of European countries with the United States right now, this is what I wanted to show you. This is the United States versus France, actually as of 2012. And the measure I'm using is what fraction of the population in different age groups actually has a job. And what you see is, well, prime age workers, 25 to 54, something that I think essentially nobody in the United States knows, which is, by the way, I'm not in my prime anymore. Anyway, that if you are a prime working years adult, you are more likely to have a job in France than in the United States. Kind of amazing thing. Nobody knows this, but in fact, France does better at providing employment to adults in their prime working years than the United States does. Big surprise. Now, very different for both the young and the old. What is that about? For the young, it's actually a slightly complicated picture. It does appear that it is harder for young people to get work in France. High minimum wages may be playing a role, labor restrictions, maybe. But a lot of the difference there is actually student aid. A lot of the Americans in that under 25 group are working while in school. They're working because they can't afford to go to college otherwise. France has much more generous student aid. And so, is that a bad thing? I think many of us would think that's a good thing. The French are actually making it easier for people to go to school, particularly for people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. In many ways, that left comparison is actually to the credit of the French economy, particularly as we're getting growing evidence that talented young Americans, unless they come from affluent families, just cannot get a good education anymore. The other end, the French system is very generous with people who take early retirement. This was policies that were put in place in the 80s and have been pretty much impossible to reverse. And no question that the incentives based on a retirement system that lets you get a substantial fraction of your benefits even if you retire at 55 is leading to a lot less employment in that top end. Is that a bad thing or a good thing? Well, it's obviously a good thing for people who'd like to stop working, but they really can't afford it. So they have, in fact, screwed up on the retirement system, which has led too many people to take early retirement. And that's, I think I mentioned, the U.S. retirement system actually is widely admired because we seem to get a lot of things right that other countries have gotten wrong. But that's a very different story. If your story is the oppressive welfare state is killing the French economy, that's a very different story from saying that the French system makes it, well, through a very specific policy screw-up, they've encouraged too many people to take early retirement. It's a very different, it's not even that clear of a left-right issue. It's just kind of Mitterrand gave away the store and they haven't been able to take it back. This is a change. So look at that prime age employment group. The Eurosclerosis was not a false story in the 1990s. In the 1990s, the French were, in fact, a lot less likely to have jobs in their prime working years than the United States. But since then, they seem to have largely solved that problem and brought a lot of people into the workforce. And then, again, one of those interesting things, we think of, although the European economy has had terrible growth performance, France is by no means the worst, and French employment has actually held up better than ours, although We're having some recovery at least, and they are not. So interesting. So what I find on these things often is that it appears that to the extent that Americans know anything about Europe, what they think they know about Europe is actually things that were true in the 1990s and haven't been true for a long time. And so we have this caricature of a sclerotic European economy, which is just not actually the reality. Okay, and as I said, back to this one, the reasons why Europe is doing so badly are to be found not in the welfare state, but in monetary and fiscal policies. And interestingly, even given the euro, things were probably worse than they needed to be. So one of the interesting stories of the last few years, actually I wrote about it somewhat in this morning's paper, but the Greek story where they faced an abrupt loss of confidence by investors, nobody would buy their bonds, and crisis, and that spread to much of Southern Europe, was taken by lots of people as an omen for all of us. There's actually quite a few articles saying, you know, America will turn into Greece unless you do what I want, which typically involved slashing Social Security and Medicare. There was always something of a counter-narrative, which said that, well, okay, there are solvency problems, and certainly, and Greece really was fiscally irresponsible, but the others, not so much. That a lot of it was simply that when a country no longer has its own currency, and particularly once it has debt that is in someone else's currency. In the case of Europe, it's someone else's currency for all of them. That they have a problem that countries that do borrow in their own currency can't have. So the US cannot run out of money because it can always print it. Now that's not exactly right, because we could run out of money if you had crazy people in Congress refusing to allow it to increase the debt and drive, but that could never happen, right? Anyway, but that aside, the U.S. can't run out of money. We can't have a liquidity crisis for the U.S. government, nor can you have one for the British government, because Britain, to its great good fortune, didn't join the euro, or in Japan, which has enormous debt but still has its own currency. How important was that factor? So there was a story, actually, one of those papers I really wish I had written. That's my highest praise. Belgian economist Paul de Grauw said that a lot of what's going on in Europe is just self-fulfilling liquidity squeeze, that people are afraid that European countries could literally run out of cash, and because they're afraid that could happen, they're actually fleeing the country's debts and greatly increasing the probability of running out of cash, with the implication that if only somebody would step up and say, look, we will not allow countries to run out of cash, things would be much better. And if I can get this, by the way, if there's students here, if you don't know, even some people who are not students, you should know about FRED. FRED is my best friend. FRED is Federal Reserve Economic Data. It's this wonderful, it's actually at the St. Louis Fed, kind of oddly. But it's this wonderful, lots and lots of data, and it will draw charts for you, and there's no reason ever to be wondering what the real numbers are on some policy question, because in 3 minutes you can draw your own charts on FRED. Anyway, so terrible crisis, Spain and Italy. Spain and Italy were starting to look like Greece, no money, and then Mario Draghi, the president of the European Central Bank, said 3 magic words. He said, "We will do whatever it takes to save the euro," which was interpreted to mean that the European Central Bank will, in fact, directly lend money to governments if it looks like they're going to run out of cash. And bing, everything went fine. And even though there's last few days have been, if you're following this stuff, the last few days have been scary. Even now, it's remarkable. Actually, Spain has lower borrowing costs than the United States. Italy only slightly higher. So it turned out that was really a lot of what people were saying, oh, it's the doom of the welfare state, was just that the European Central Bank was not doing its job. And once it started doing its job, things got a lot better. Now, is Europe okay? No, it's not. but not because of the welfare state. It turns out that even the whatever it takes helped a lot, but already now Europe has had a long period of being very depressed. Inflation is sliding, verging on deflation. We've seen this movie before. We've seen it in Japan. Japan entered a state of more or less permanent depression in the 1990s and has never emerged. It's still there. And finds very, very difficult to break out. People have, when the Japanese phenomenon emerged, there were, I think most American and European economists reacted by not paying any attention at all. And those who did, for the most part, said, well, the Japanese have screwed up, or Japan is very different, we're nothing like Japan. There were a few people who did take the Japanese experience as an omen. I was one of them. Actually, when I started at Princeton in 2000, we had 4 senior faculty who were all big Japan warriors. Now that I'm leaving, I'll be the last one out. I guess I'm supposed to turn off the lights. But there was an interesting group. It was myself, Lars Svensson, who went back to Sweden, tried to get Sweden not to repeat the mistakes that the Japanese had made, failed, and Sweden is actually looking very Japanese these days. Mike Woodford is not a household name, but is arguably our leading macroeconomic theorist, and he moved to Columbia. And there was a 4th guy. What's his name? Ben Bernanke. Don't know what happened to him. Now, one of the things that we would say, though, is that, so actually, in retrospect, we were all harshly critical of Japan's policies. Why isn't the Japanese central bank, the Ministry of Finance, why aren't they doing more to fight this? And of course, if anything like that happened here, we would do a much better job. Actually, we've done a worse job. Our response has been even more inadequate, and Europe worse still. So I have actually proposed that the original Gang of 4 Japan warriors should all go to Tokyo and apologize to the emperor. But one of the things that one would say about Japan is that part of the Japanese problem is demography. Japan has very low fertility rate. They also don't accept immigration. So the Japanese working age population has actually been shrinking since the late 1990s, now shrinking at about 1.5% a year, which is, now there's 2 problems there. One is the one people talk about, who's going to pay for the retirement benefits. We worry about that to some extent for the baby boomers here. But the other is, if you have a shrinking labor force, why should businesses invest? Why add capacity when there's going to be fewer workers every year? And that contributes to a persistently depressed economy. And we would say, well, okay, we don't have that. Oh, sorry. Skip that one. I'm not even going to try and do it. This is the working age population in the Euro area. And turns out Europe is a lot like that. They're not at Japanese rates of decline, but their working age population has started to decline at a fairly rapid clip. Ours is still growing, but much, much more slowly than it was before. We've dropped from 1% a year to, I think, 0.4% a year now. So actually, we're looking quite Japanese. The European, and in fact, actually, to some extent, we are doing better than the Europeans. I think not only because we at least do have a central government, but also because our demography is better, because we have more immigration and higher fertility rates. And for those who think that population growth is a big environmental problem, fair enough, but if you're going to try and limit it, you better have a strategy for making sure that the monetary side works out, and neither the Europeans nor us have that at this point. The European situation, I think, is quite bleak, but not at all because of the welfare state. Their problem is again, the single currency. I would argue was a big mistake. The demography has turned unfavorable and they weren't ready for it. They screwed up even given the single currency, they didn't have to have as much austerity as they did. And they are, if you read this morning's New York Times, it says some Europeans are starting to argue that austerity has been too extreme, and it does make you want to, again, bang your head on the table. I mean, if you ask me, when did I start telling them that? And the answer would be spring of 2010. And only now they're starting to notice. But and I actually feel Mario Draghi and his colleagues are actually, they understand all of this. They just have limited tools. If you want to know what the future holds for Europe, of course nobody knows, but I'm actually very scared for reasons that, the economic prospects look quite bad. And it's not just that the economy is performing badly, but the entire European political elite coalesced around the policies that are now failing. Everybody was for hard money and austerity. Everybody said this is the way to go. Actually, everybody was for the euro, which now looks like a terrible mistake. What happens when you have a persistently depressed economy, high unemployment, lots of suffering, and everybody, essentially the entire center of the political spectrum, has committed to and identified with the policies that have so dramatically failed? Well, we've seen that movie before too. I don't know if people know about Godwin's law. Godwin's law is originally it was actually, the statement was that any sufficiently extended discussion on the internet will end with somebody talking about the Nazis. But it has turned into meaning that if the first person to mention the Nazis is considered to have lost the argument. And so we have a problem talking about parallels with the 1930s, because you immediately run into Godwin's law violations. But if elections were held today, the left would win in Greece, and these are not bad people. I actually think Syriza, the party that is now leading in the polls, they have good intentions, but they might very well take Greece out of the euro. If the election were held today in France, Marine Le Pen, the extreme anti-immigrant party, would probably win. If the election were held in we have separatist movements, the Lega Nord in Italy. We have Britain has it is not on the euro, but and has had some economic recovery, but still a lot of feeling that the elites are discredited, and I think right now, if they held an election in Britain, UKIP, the violently anti-immigrant group, would probably come in as the second largest party after the Conservatives. The whole other story, the haplessness of the European left, just drives you up the wall. We say about Miliband in England that he's Britain's version of Francois Hollande, which tells you what people like me think of both of them. But anyway, so this is scary. You really worry, and of course, if Syriza fails in Greece, behind them is Golden Dawn. And just look at their symbol, with these two sort of things like this side by side, but might as well just do a quick rotation. It looks like something you may remember. So it is a very scary thing, but and I have to say, for purely selfish pedagogical reasons, that's a shame, because it turns out the stuff I'm trying to teach about, and what we're talking about here, which is inequality, welfare state, the role of government, Europe is still, if they can get past this, which doesn't look too likely, they are still a useful, I think, instructive role model, which says that we do have choices. And that's where I want to come back to. You can screw up your macroeconomics, and that ruins everything. One Great Depression can ruin your whole day. But on other things, can you help the poor? Can you have generous programs without destroying the economy? Actually, yes. You may pay some price. We don't know, although in some respects it may actually be beneficial, because it means that people from lower incomes have access to education and other things. Can you guarantee health care to everyone? Well, actually, the international evidence is really clear. The quality of care seems to be essentially the same in all advanced countries, except until now, the United States has been unique in having a lot of people who don't actually have coverage. We're closing a good part of that gap, yay. And the question was, how much more do the Europeans spend in order to cover everybody? And the answer is about 50% less. So it turns out that that's not at all a hard thing to do based on the international evidence. We learned that well-designed policies are important. Taking care of retired people is a good thing. You do want to make sure that the program is set up with the right incentives, which miraculously the United States by and large did, and many Europeans did not. But you learn that we have choices. And that, if it weren't for the Great Recession, that would have been my theme entirely here, that you never take high levels of poverty, great suffering as something that has to happen. All the evidence that's relevant says that in fact these are choices you can make. Doesn't mean that you have to run the United States exactly like France. Doesn't mean that you have to imitate anybody exactly. It's just saying that there are decisions to be made. And of course I have political preferences. I think the American system is just harsher, more brutal than it needs to be, and I would like to see us move somewhat, at least, in the direction of the Europeans, which on one important front we did, which is health reform. But in any case, what we learning from Europe is a big thing, because Europe has shown us that smart, advanced countries with sophisticated technology can be run in different ways. And we should try, as best we can, to figure out what we want and see how it can be done. Never say that there are no alternatives. And with that, I think I throw it up for questions.
Yes, thanks for a very interesting discussion. Do you think the Germans will do you think the Germans will continue to vehemently resist a loosening of monetary policy a la QE 2, 1, or 3,
okay,
sending Europe perhaps into a real recession?
Okay, so for those who don't know, in Europe, as in the United States, the normal tool of monetary policy, which is short-term interest rates that the central bank can control, is zero. No room for further cuts. So what we've done in the United States, what they did in Britain as well, is to have the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, go out and buy lots of things that normally they don't buy. Long-term government debt, debt of the housing agencies, which is known as quantitative easing, which is a very unhelpful term, but anyway. The European Central Bank is talking about doing that, and Germany, which has in many ways dictated policy, has been very negative on that, and some Germans are saying no. There's some funny dynamics in all of that. Europe is kind of an interesting place because they are, on policy issues, they are by and large more sophisticated sometimes than the officials are, more sophisticated than they can let on that they actually are. So that they will talk a hard line in public, but actually be a lot more flexible in private. And so far, there have been several occasions when Mario Draghi had a proposal, and the Germans on the board of the European Central Bank voted against him, but only after first making sure that they would lose the vote. That is, they're not idiots, and they do say that. But the thing that's a problem now is, back home, first of all, the German public doesn't get any of this, and quite a few German politicians don't get any of this. And it may be that the kinds of things that Draghi is talking about doing now are in fact illegal under the agreement that created the European Central Bank. The German Constitutional Court is going to rule on that, and so they may have no choice. So I'm not sure. There is some combination of bloody-mindedness by German politicians and some German academics as well. The German public has, the German politicians, I'd say that Merkel's biggest sin is not so much what she has done as in making no effort at all to enlighten the German public. And now when they're at the moment of crisis, the German public understands nothing. But I think it's very difficult, and even if Draghi got the green light, not clear that it's big enough. So I think if you had to make a I'm trying to not talk economies or jargon, and I can't manage it here. If you're going to make a maximum likelihood estimate of what's going to happen, it's disaster. But you know, let's hope for the best. And yeah, I mean, again, and these people, you know, most certainly the ECB, I think even the people in the German finance ministry are not idiots, but that doesn't mean that a really stupid outcome won't happen. Yeah.
Paul, yeah, Mark Skousen, how you doing?
Okay.
In quite a few of your charts, you use per capita GDP for your statistics. The Economist has pointed out that if you use per capita GDP instead of just real GDP, Japan turns out to not have the lowest per capita GDP growth, but it goes to the top. It's ahead of the United States. It's ahead of the UK for quite some time. So actually, doesn't that go contrary? If you are consistent to use your per capita GDP data, doesn't that go contrary to your view that Japan is stagnating?
Okay, so actually that's not quite right. Japanese per capita GDP has fallen relative to the US over this whole period. Japanese GDP per working age person fell some, but not very much. So Japanese performance since the early 90s looks not nearly as bad if you deflate by the working age population. Now, then the counterfactual would be, you know, Japan was rapidly converging on the U.S. until the financial crisis hit. So probably they went wrong somewhere. But let me put it, the way I would say this is that Japanese performance, they clearly have been, there are many indicators suggesting that they've been a persistently depressed economy, but not as depressed as many people think. And the interesting thing about Japan is that they have avoided mass suffering. They've never had large-scale unemployment the way that we and the Europeans both have. Their social cohesion has always been a lot better than ours. Some of that takes place through channels that we might not like. There's still a pretty, their glass ceiling on women in the labor force is about 6 inches off the ground. So it's but in many ways, their handling of it is not so bad. I would say if we compare the past 7 years in Europe and the United States with the first 7 years of Japan's 2 lost decades, Japan switched its position from being a cautionary tale to being a role model. Because they did it badly, but we've done it worse. Yeah.
Thank you. Would you please comment on the concept that the very high cost of education today will hurt America in the long run in terms of its competitive position internationally? And how long will it take for this phenomenon to become apparent?
Okay, well, we know, actually, that the U.S., you know, we used to have, by far, the best educated population in the advanced world. We were sending the highest proportion of young people to college, and that's no longer true by a long shot. So we're rapidly moving down the ranks in terms of education. Competitive position, I think, is a problematic term here. U.S. productivity, well, again, actually, U.S. productivity is not very different from that of Western Europe, somewhat higher than Japan. We did have a period when we had faster productivity growth. The European convergence, or they're pulling ahead, seemed to have come to a stop, but we think that's mostly other. I don't think it's the education. Put it this way, how do I want to say this? There are some other things that the United States has done right, or at least done differently, which are almost, which don't figure into many stories. So the U.S. had fairly rapid productivity growth between the mid-90s and the middle of the last decade, and a lot of that seems to have been big box retailers. And there are various reasons why that phenomenon spread faster in the U.S. So, but I think that if the question is the United States losing its edge, you can already see that. We are no longer on a number of dimensions ahead of the pack, and maybe behind. The trouble is that as the Europeans move up the league tables on education, they're meanwhile screwing up their monetary and fiscal policy, so it's hard to identify what's really going on. But what's really, really true is that we have a very high cost of education and a hugely inadequate and increasingly inadequate system of aid for education. So the perpetuation of class differences, the inability of students born into low SES socioeconomic status households to move up is getting worse. And we know already, this is now long since, if people think that America is the land of opportunity, you're exactly wrong. We have the least social mobility of any advanced country. Yeah.
Could you say a little bit about Sub-Sahara Africa and Latin America? There's so much talk about U.S., China, right, Europe, India. Sub-Saharan Africa is supposed to have population exploding. Can you say a little bit?
Wow. Okay. I'm tempted to answer no, because I don't know. No, I know almost nothing about Sub-Saharan Africa. Just never had time to do the homework. I do know that we finally had some decent growth numbers for Africa for the first time in a very long time. And the little bit I've read says that serious analysts think that this is real. It's not just favorable commodity prices. That there actually is finally some signs that Africa, parts of it at least, are turning the corner economically. But of course, it's still such a troubled area. And then, well, you know, we're now worried about infectious diseases, which I have not written on, and I shouldn't say, but I've been telling people I've been avoiding that subject like the plague. But but no, that's very serious, and it's one of the things about Africa. The great tragedy actually has been that things that are not normally the domain of economics keep on getting in the way. There was a period when civil wars were just wreaking havoc with the sub-Saharan African economic situation. That has calmed down a great deal, but now we have disease problems which are cropping up. And the little bit I've seen says that we aside from the direct effect, Ebola is actually hugely disruptive of economic transactions. You know, people, you have to stop people from moving, you have to stop goods from moving, so that's not what we needed. Latin America is also an area that has done better recently, and they're having some problems backing up, and some of the economies have been mismanaged. Venezuela very much so. Argentina, actually, after having had a good recovery from their crisis, they didn't know when to stop on the heterodox policies, and so that's a bad thing. But overall, they've done pretty well. They're having a bit of a moment. Brazil is having a bit of trouble. I don't think it's anything like a crisis. And interestingly, Latin America is the one part of the world where there's been a marked decline in economic inequality over the past decade, and it's no mystery. It's policy. Lots more aid to the poor. Although it turns out that it's not a lot of money. It's 1 or 2% of GDP, but the poor are so poor that makes a big difference. Other policies designed to limit. So Brazil is still a wildly unequal society, but not as wildly unequal as it was. Same is true of Mexico. And they're actually a hopeful story. They have to weather this current conjuncture in the world economy, but it's not so bad. There's been some good stuff from Latin America. It's actually been a surprise. Everything gets overhyped. When people were talking about Brazil and this gigantic boom, it was never that. The Brazilians have a joke. They say Brazil is the country of the future and always will be, and that's still true. But but not a bad story. I mean, it's an interesting thing, right? All my career, I've been. Well, among other things, I've been kind of an ambulance chaser. I've always worked on financial crises, currency crises, and it used to be that you had to go to, if you wanted to go talk to people, you had to fly to Buenos Aires or Jakarta, and now it can be Madrid, or actually, to a certain extent, you can just take a commuter train into Manhattan. So so at this point, actually, the story, Latin America in particular, which was always the place that was going off the rails, is no longer. This time they're getting some backwash from the mess up in the advanced world, but they themselves have actually been running their economies a lot better than they used to.
Dr. Krugman,
Yeah.
I heard you speak about Japan, but you didn't talk about Abenomics. Would you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, Abenomics, actually, I have to say it's in part it's a gratifying story because some serious economists gave the Japanese advice about what they should do, and they took that advice 16 years later. So it's actually, Japan, Abenomics is basically doing what Lars Svensson and Ben Bernanke and I were telling them to do back in 1998, which is a very aggressive monetary expansion to try and get the inflation rate up, and a declaration, we will do this, trying to convince people. The first year went really quite well. They did manage to raise inflation expectations. The Japanese economy accelerated. Then they did something which I still has me shaking my head, which is they had a scheduled rise in the VAT, in the sales tax. And clearly, you didn't want to do that. You wanted to hold off until the economy had momentum, but they went through with it, and the recovery stalled, at least for, at this point, appears to have stalled because of that mistake. So why they didn't feel they could postpone fiscal austerity until they had a good, solid recovery and 2 or 3% inflation, I still don't get. So that's, maybe they can recover. They believe they can recover from that. And the central bank, the Bank of Japan, is declaring that they are absolutely committed to breaking out of this. So we'll see. But now Abenomics is very much, it fits in with everything I've been saying. What they're doing is they're saying, okay, we know that we have to create an environment where people don't find that sitting on cash is the best investment. We have to get, and how do we do that? We have to do that. We have to really promise that we will do whatever it takes to get moderate levels of inflation. And they stumbled over the tax increase, but maybe they can recover from that stumble, and we'll see. But it is an interesting thing that right now, if you ask which government in the advanced world seems to be thinking most clearly about what their economy needs, it's actually the Japanese. Okay. Yeah, did we have a, oh, there's some, yeah, we can get a mic down here eventually, yeah.
Hello, Louis Taloni. I was just wondering, how do you think if Europe, of all the nations of the European Union, decide to centralize a government, you know, come up with one big government instead of having the different nations have their own sovereign, do you think that would make a big difference, and if what kind of changes would lead to it?
Well, I mean, it would make a huge difference, but I can't imagine how you get there.
It's too insane of a question?
What's sorry?
A little too insane of a question?
No, I mean, no, the first part is, I mean, I think everything, it's funny, when there was debate about a single currency for Europe, Europeans would often say, well, you know, you have in the United States a continent-sized currency, single currency area. That seems to work okay, so why can't we do that? Especially since our continent is actually a lot smaller geographically than yours. And to which the best answer was that, well, the U.S. has a unified government, which makes a lot of things work better. There are some other issues too, but that's the most important. How did we get there? And if you actually ask, how is it that the United States has this continent-wide unified government, a sense of nationhood? Well, you know, it took the Civil War to do that. So if you actually look, some historians have pointed out, what did you call this country? In 1855, people talked about these United States. They identified themselves as Virginians or New Jersey residents first, and then only sort of secondarily as part of this confederation of states. After the Civil War, they referred to it, as we do now, as the United States. So what this would suggest, if that's the role model, well, what the Europeans need to do is have a vast war. Anyway. So, and how you get there, I mean, the European project, if you follow this stuff, this is now 60 years of a project of trying to build greater unity in Europe, which was largely by using economic integration to foster greater closeness and political integration. And it worked well for a long time, but then the premature move to a single currency really has screwed that up. And I think the Europeans are more inclined to think of themselves as Germans or Greeks or Spaniards rather than Europeans than they were 7, 8 years ago. So how you get from there to a unified government, I don't see. It just it's a great tragedy, but how do you do that? And yeah, so it's technically the answers are clear, but we just don't see any way to get to that point. So
good afternoon. I had a quick.
Okay, I am trying to get Sylvia Nasser wants to ask a question. I'm trying to get her on mic when we can, but I can talk to someone else first. Oh, here we go. Great.
I just want to ask you why American men are working less.
Yes.
Especially if the U.S. Social Security system doesn't, unlike the French, encourage early retirement.
That's a question to which I don't know the answer. I mean, I'll tell you what we know. So there's been a drastic drop-off in men working since the Great Recession hit, but there was a long-term downward trend even before. And that was true even within prime working years. And the question we ask is several things. Why is this happening? How is it happening? What are these guys living off? A fair number are in prison. So one thing has been that we have an enormous prison population, but not entirely. Some people collecting disability, although it's not nearly as easy to go on disability as legend has it. Other people, we're not even sure how the income is being supplied or what's going on. I thought one answer to why it happens, actually, I view that what seems to be happening to the American working class is actually kind of a vindication of William Julius Wilson. If you know, the sociologist who famously argued that the kind of dissolution of social structure for many African-American families was not because of welfare, was not because of some mysterious cultural breakdown, but because decent jobs became unavailable, because the African-American population was concentrated in urban areas and manufacturing left, and the jobs that they could have ceased to be. And then, so people got marginalized and men dropped out of the workforce. In the last 15 years, a lot of the country has become like that. Manufacturing jobs have disappeared all across the board, employment opportunities, and by God, the white working class is starting to look a lot like, not just dropping out of the labor force, but also a lot of the social problems. Well, I actually have never watched Breaking Bad, but think about if we used to think, drugs was something that happened in the ghetto. Now we think about meth epidemics in rural areas. So our best guess is that the real harshness, collapse of opportunities for many working age people in the United States has led to men dropping out. But we don't know. It is a great mystery, and by the way, hugely influences your assessment of where we are now. How much of that drop, I wonder if I can find that picture, how much of that drop is a transitory thing because of the recession, and how much is a continuation? You can see it's trending down between 2000 and 2007, and how much of this is the collapse of ability or willingness to work on the part of American men, because it's much more concentrated among men than women. So we have, yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. Adam Yumtov. By any chance, did you happen to see the documentary that came out on Tuesday, October 14th, Unfair, Exposing the IRS?
Unfair what, sorry?
Unfair, Exposing the IRS,
No.
Internal Revenue Service.
I don't have a TV.
No, it was in the theaters in over 700
no,
theaters
certainly
nationwide. I was wondering if you could comment on how we could possibly defend the current way in which the IRS administers our federal income tax code in such an abusive, destructive, discriminatory way. And then secondly, why does the United States, founded as a republic with democratic and capitalistic ideals, tolerate a tax system that's predicated on the second principle of Engels and Marx's Communist Manifesto with a graduated income tax system?
I think you might want to actually read what the Founding Fathers actually said, which is not at all the way that's being portrayed. But you know, I think we got where you're coming from, and I don't know if there's a way I can answer that under the circumstances.
Hi, good afternoon.
Just,
excuse me.
Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. You talked a couple times in your speech about how sometimes the actions of central bankers and politicians make you want to smack your head on a desk. I was wondering, do you feel like you have the ability to speak directly to them, or do they just have to do you feel like you just have to publish and talk and hope they hear it?
Oh, okay. Yeah, people I have spoken with, all right? I have spoken with the president on a number of occasions. I've spoken with all of our central bankers here and there. I've not spoken with Merkel, but the person, I think this is a mysticism that many people have, which is that the idea is that if only someone could get in front of, you know, and present the case personally, that would make all the difference, and it's not. Many of these things are rooted in the opinions of much larger groups and in political realities. So that even if, for all I know, at 2 in the morning, Angela Merkel wakes up and thinks, boy, this austerity is a terrible mistake. But if she did that, she would just lose her party in Germany. She would lose she has to cater. I suspect that's not true, but even if it did, she has to cater to the Swabian housewife who thinks that people should spend no more than they earn, and so on. So I don't think it's that easy. I think the problem you have is that there is a social, political logic that leads to bad policies. Sometimes there's just intellectual failure as well. So I think if I obviously wouldn't spend so much time arguing the intellectual case if I didn't think it could make some difference. But it's certainly not a problem that they don't hear it. And bear in mind, by the way, if you, what I say about macroeconomic policy is essentially indistinguishable these days from what the IMF says about it. They have, you know, Olivier Blanchard, my classmate, former colleague, chief economist of the IMF, has to use different language than I can use, but if you actually parse the substance, it's really no different. So it's not as if these views are not being heard in the corridors of power. It's that for various reasons they either don't want to hear them or they just feel that they can't afford to pay attention.
Hi.
How much time do we have here?
I think it's me. Is it me?
Sorry.
Okay. So I have a two-pronged question. When you talk about the employment rate over here.
Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
sorry.
With the mics, there's no directional sense.
When you talk about the employment rate for people 16 to 24 in this country and how there are so many students that are working full-time, is it a surprise to you that there aren't more young people, you know, at talks like this and involving themselves economically and politically? And is there anything you'd like to say to encourage young people to involve or inform themselves economically and politically?
Wow. Yes. So I'm actually, yeah, it's interesting. I have to say, maybe it's the timing. There aren't as many young people, but in this talk, but by and large, when I give college talks, there are plenty. So it's not that. And I think, well, look, we are in fact still a democracy with a vote, and if people, if people understand the issues, take a stand on them, and go out and vote, that makes a huge difference. I mean, if you want to, the United States actually, so to be a little more caustic here, the U.S. welfare state is a lot smaller than other countries in the Western world, but it's not smaller across the board. We actually have pretty extensive welfare state for 65 and older. We have guaranteed single-payer health care. We have a retirement guarantee. So we essentially have a full-scale European-style welfare state for seniors, but very, very little for younger people. It's gotten better. At least we have health care reform now, and we've done some other things. Why is that? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that seniors vote and young people often don't. So if you want a system that is better for people like yourself and for the next generation behind you, go out and vote. If we had voter participation rates among young people that were comparable to those among seniors, America would look very, very different and better.
Excuse me. I'm just wondering regarding actually Middle Eastern economics, because I know that Saudi Arabia doesn't tax its citizens, and that the Emirati people, I know they have like a massive increase in Dubai in terms of like their urbanization. So I really wanted to understand kind of what's going on in that area, because it seems very weird how they can tax their citizens so low and yet maintain.
I am utterly ignorant there. Just not a thing. Except these are petro states. They have oil, which generates a lot of revenue with essentially no involvement on the part of their own citizenry. It's just there, and it's used to subsidize the citizens who I don't know about Saudi Arabia. I know in many of the Gulf states the citizens are a minority of the population now. So you actually have a large workforce which is from all over, though a lot of Pakistanis in particular, and then you have people who are given some piece of the oil revenue. It's a very strange, but you just don't want to think about an oil-rich country a country that derives 60 or 80% of its GDP from oil as being anything like an economy, like any other kind of economy. It's just a different world. It's almost like a stage set of an economy, you might say. It's really just oil. Okay, so. Yeah.
And then two, in the foreign trade, is it likely for dynamics to change with Russia and Iran?
Okay. Yeah. Again, I'm largely ignorant. Why it's happening? We are seeing a real global slowdown. Maybe not a global recession, or not yet, but a real slowdown. So demand is dropping off. Particularly, actually, China, but is having its own thing, but also Europe, and at the same time, as I understand, there was some supply that was offline that's coming back. So Libya, though things are not calm, the oil production is coming back, and so on. It's helpful to us and the Europeans because it means that purchasing power of our populations rise because of falling prices at the pump. It's obviously not helpful for countries that rely on oil as a source of revenue. As I understand it, and now I'm totally ignorant, I'm just repeating what I heard from people down the hall in the Wilson School. Iran it's unlikely to do anything. Russia is more interesting because Russia is it's a kind of a, well, it is a kleptocracy held together in part by the patronage that Putin can offer via, which he can offer because of the oil revenues. And if oil's going down, that does make life harder. But I don't know, I don't think anyone has any idea whether it's actually politically destabilizing in either place.
Bringing back to your area of expertise.
Yeah.
Given your pessimism about Europe, what is the impact on the United States?
Okay.
Do you foresee that as being the impact, and what do we have to do to address it ahead of time?
Okay, so I think there was no mic for those who are getting this and streaming. The question was, if Mike's pessimism about Europe is justified, what does that do to the United States, and what should we do? Okay, this is stuff I've done a lot. So the direct spillover to the U.S. economy is actually smaller than many people imagine. The world is not all that flat. So if you actually ask what share of U.S. GDP is exported to Europe, it's about 2%. So it's not even bad stuff. Really bad stuff in Europe doesn't have that much direct impact on U.S. exports. There's another issue, which is the the rising dollar, which is reflecting the difficulties in Europe, that makes U.S. exports less competitive, and that gives us a further hit. And then there's contagion of forms that that are harder to pin down, but financial contagion through corporations and banks that have interests on both sides of the Atlantic, and psychological contagion. So one of the odd things, if you look at the measurable links among advanced economies, they're not that strong. I mean, within Europe, they're that strong. Between the United States and Europe, they're not that strong. And yet, we normally do have a synchronized business cycle, which is telling you that there are other channels of influence. What the United States should be doing, well, we should have a Federal Reserve that's prepared to reconsider its plan to normalize monetary policy because with some bad stuff coming, which we do. And then all we have to do otherwise is we just have to have a reasonable discussion with congressional leaders and get them to agree that they will change their fiscal policies in a way that sustains the U.S. economy, and also a pony for everybody. So that's all we have. The Fed is all we have. I mean, there is no flexibility anywhere else in the U.S. system.
I was wondering, I just wanted to refer back to a question that was asked previously about fewer men working.
Yeah.
Do you think that the technology revolution is partly responsible that there are, I don't know what's going to happen to people who are unable to get into the technology, the retraining they talk about. People, not everybody has the skills or the talent or the interest to do that. Is there going to be just a huge decrease in the kind of lower and middle class? Are they going to be left behind?
There's a fair bit of evidence that we're seeing a hollowing out, that we have high-paying elite jobs are still there, although it's getting narrower and narrower. And then, so if you actually ask about what the impact of technology is, it's not that there are jobs for people who can program, right, or something like that. That's not at all how it works. There never are that many jobs of that kind anyway, and in many cases, those jobs are actually offshoreable. But what actually appears to be the case, or best guess, is the jobs that are most resilient to technological change are the ones that involve common sense, basic human skills, hands-on contact, which are things that we still are not close to being able to do with machines. Those are often low-paying jobs. So we're not getting robot gardeners and janitors yet. We're not actually particularly close to self-driving cars in the real world yet. But we are taking a lot of things, often things that we thought of as relatively skilled professions, but that become largely stuff that can be automated now. If you go back to the Industrial Revolution, the Luddites were not ordinary menial workers. The Luddites were skilled weavers who suddenly found that power looms had made them irrelevant. And now, something is happening. I just was in a really interesting meeting yesterday, but it was about developing a research program because no one quite knows what's going on. Something has happened. The labor share of national income, which was stable for a long time, is now dropping. Is that because of technology? No one knows for sure. You can make guesses. How much of it is because of globalization? You can make guesses. I think the point would be that it's really hard to figure out, and the lessons of history are not wildly encouraging. Although we think, well, if you think about 200 years of Industrial Revolution and workers gained a lot too, the first 50 years or so of the Industrial Revolution, probably not. And so, if you say, well, this is all going to work out 50 years from now, that's not much comfort. And for that matter, of course, if you're thinking seriously about information technology, somewhere along that way, maybe the machines just get smarter than we are, or if not, at any rate, Skynet kills us all. So I don't know how many people have seen Terminator movies, but anyway, but it's a really it's problematic, and that is a big story that people are just starting to wrap their minds around. Because we've spent a long time thinking that inequality was about highly educated and skilled workers versus unskilled workers. Right now, it's starting to look like something much more old-fashioned, capital versus labor. Part of the Piketty work, although he didn't really address the technology issue, plays into that, because right now, if you were going to ask what is the big question, it really is kind of profits versus wages in general, not college graduates versus those without a college degree. And if you ask, well, if we have to figure out what's happening, but also if you ask what we can do, one of the things you can certainly do is have a good enough welfare state so that health care is still there, so that education remains affordable and so on. And that's, that may not be the answer you'd want to hear, but that's at least mitigates whatever it is that's going on.
Is there any way that you can see German policy changing to take the European Union in a more positive economic direction?
Okay, you have to hope that it can happen. And I think there is, let's put it this way, if you want me to tell a story that I think that's not completely implausible, it would be that Germany is finding that they themselves are suffering from the woes of the European situation. And the good news is that the bad news is good news, because in fact, Germany seems to be stalling right now. And it's a funny thing, if you actually look at the German economy, it's not an economy with strong domestic roots. German's consumer spending is quite weak. Germany is able to have more or less full employment now only by having an enormous trade surplus. And of course, if the rest of Europe is in big trouble, that trade surplus erodes. Also, they don't just export to the rest of Europe, but they're selling a lot of stuff to China, which is having its own problems. So I think the story that many people are hoping for, many of the people I talk to are hoping for, is that sometime in the next year or so, as Germany sees that, hey, we're getting caught in this downdraft also, that they're willing to rethink and follow and approve, let's say, a significant Europe-wide infrastructure program, are willing to give Mario Draghi a free hand to do whatever he can with quantitative easing. We'll see. It's a problem because among other things, the German style of economic rhetoric is very different from ours. They don't actually, the officials, I mean, privately, many of them talk in the same terms that I do, but the official language, it tends to be more in terms of almost, well, as people say, in Germany, economics is a branch of moral philosophy. Debt is bad, virtue is important, and it's very hard, I think, particularly for officials who have spent a number of years talking that way, to suddenly say, actually, you know, we need to run some deficits because we're getting caught up in this recession too. Okay.
Because of pressures of time, we're going to take 3 more questions and bring the whole event to an end. Thank you.
Yes, hello. So I just wanted to...
Oh, where was?
Right here.
Okay, we'll take that one, and then we'll take you next.
I just wanted to touch upon the welfare state and social inequality. I was born and raised in Italy, and I've been living here on and off for a number of years. And I can see that there's a huge difference, definitely, between the two cultures. First of all, education. Everybody seems to have a normal education across all social levels, which is why I also think that people are much more political in Europe. I mean, we used to go on public marches because the school was missing toilet paper, even for stupid things like that. But definitely, it's reminding me that you know, when you walk around different.
Is there a question, because we have limited time? So
yes, I just want to know: does Europe need to follow the monetary policy from the U.S., and should the U.S. learn more from Europe's example of welfare state?
Well, yes. I mean, that's what I've been saying, I think. Not that everything the Europeans do on their welfare states is right. You don't want French retirement policy. Actually, you don't want Italian labor regulations, which really do encourage a lot of off-the-books working. But the notion that you can do a lot more to protect the unlucky is right, and the European experience shows that. On the other hand, that you really need to have a policy to maintain full employment is something that the United States is not doing well at, but better than the Europeans, and they need to learn from that. Yeah, so.
Right. The next question.
Yeah.
Right. As we listened so carefully to what you said about the European model, the American model, and all the things that are shifting around us worldwide, what does it mean if the United States is not the dominant economy and China becomes and is going to be the dominant economy? Then there are different things at play all over the world. And how does this influence us? Does it? Doesn't it? What's the impact economically upon us at this time?
Yeah, I think that we're quite a ways from China actually being the dominant economy. It's supposedly, if we adjust for purchasing power, they're now, by some measures, the biggest economy, but that actually doesn't matter. The dollar value of their production is still quite a lot less than ours, and that's kind of what matters. And we don't know the answer. I mean, we've had an international system which not only, it's not the simple U.S. hegemony. Actually, in many areas, it's actually a U.S.-European joint rulership, like international trade policy. But it has worked as well as it has, and compared with before World War II, it's worked pretty well. It's worked as well as it has, I think, because not just because we had a hegemon, the United States, but also we had a hegemon that shared crucial values with the other big economies. So we've had a world of democratic, essentially democratic nations, by and large market economies, so I think that's less important, but democratic values of inclusiveness, openness, free press, and so on, which has made it easier than might otherwise be the case to agree on important things. What happens if and when we reach a point where many of the most important players in the world are just not part of that universe? Don't know. We haven't ever tried that, and it might be a big problem. Okay, last question somewhere. Okay, there we are.
I think it was a couple weeks ago, David Cameron, Prime Minister of the UK, said, we want to wipe out unemployment, so the way we're going to do this is essentially if you're young and you don't have a job, you're going to be forced to work essentially for free, and you're going to get work experience and do all of this. I guess short-term, long-term, what are the implications if that actually happens for like the UK?
I don't think that's actually a policy that's on the books. I mean, let's just put it this way. There's this remarkable delusion that you do find among politicians both sides of the Atlantic, which is that the reason young people don't have jobs is because or people in general, but certainly young people don't have jobs is because they don't want to work. And actually, does anybody ever still read the book, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre? The great film with Humphrey Bogart and all that, but the book opens with this wonderful thing where it says, anyone who really wants to work can find a job. Only do not ask the man who tells you this whether he has a job available or any of his friends has a job available. He offers this out of the goodness of his heart and to show how little he knows the world. Because the reality is that's not the problem. We are not having a problem where young people can't find work because they don't have the motivation or they don't have the skills. We're having a problem because there are not enough jobs out there. And if you try to force it, it's just going to end in grief. End of story.
I think you all will agree with me that this was a wonderful presentation. And thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you next month when Professor Sylvia Nasser will make her presentation. Thank you all.